this lecture, I'm going to define what quantitative data is and talk through some different types of quantitative data that we might use in political science studies. So, what is quantitative data? Quantitative data is evidence that could be converted into numbers, that we can quantify, that we can put into a spreadsheet, that we can turn into a data set observation. And so we can think of three different types of quantitative data. The first would be macro data, macro level data. And this is data that is aggregated or at the system-wide level. So for example, you might have something like the World Development Indicators, which is a data set produced by the World Bank that gives indicators on things like levels of poverty, literacy, health incomes, the basis of the economy for different countries throughout the world. And so here you are aggregating an individual, right, up in, say, Peru, and talking about overall what's the level of literacy in Peru. You originally measured that by looking at individuals in Peru, but if you go to the data set, it just gives you the numbers for different countries like Peru, like Bangladesh, etc. So this is at the macro level. It's called macro data. Microdata is data at the individual level. And so, for example, here we could talk about the ANES, the American National Election Survey, which we've talked about already in this class. And the ANES doesn't aggregate up by overall levels of participation and beliefs in the United States. The data points are individual respondents, and then you can use your analysis and talk about trends in individuals, but the data set itself keeps things at that individual level. So most survey data is at the micro level. And then in between would be meso-level data. And this would be data about collective actors, organizations. These groups could include companies, it could include political parties, could include organizations. So one example of this is something called the Manifesto Project. And the Manifesto Project looks at different political parties throughout the world and goes through their platforms and creates data on different trends in their platforms. So here you're making a data set that looks at the organization of a political party. It's not about what individuals are doing, and it's not at such a macro level as what countries are doing. And the goal of quantitative data is to discern general patterns overall. Remember, we have data set observations here, and you're looking for generalizability. So you want to be thinking about what level of data you need to talk about the patterns that are relevant for your question. So the rest of the lecture, I'm going to go through some different sources of data, some different types of quantitative data sets that we might see. The first one that you probably would automatically think of would be surveys. So surveys are brief, structured interviews that are conducted with many respondents, that ideally you have maybe 1,000 or 2,000 respondents that answer a battery of different questions you have over a short-ish period of time, say 20 to 30 minutes, so that you're able to collect a lot of information from people on several different variables, as many variables as you possibly can, from lots of different respondents. And so the goal here is to come up with generalizable data that you would say that the individuals that respond to your survey represent overall that population. So examples would be the ANES. And so that would be the main example that we would think of. There are also lots of other ones. There are international data sets like the General Social Survey, World Values Survey, Latino Barometro, lots of different public opinion data sets that people use when they want to use surveys. Another thing to remember is that survey experiments are a form of survey, and these are often actually embedded in something like the ANES or in a Gallup poll. And so this is another type of survey that we could see. The second type of quantitative data that we might observe is what is perhaps the biggest, most common form of data set, and this would be observations of human behavior. So with surveys, you're asking people what they think about something. Here, you're just observing what human beings do. So in an observational data set, researchers either directly or indirectly observe and record human behavior. Directly would be if the researcher is watching the respondent, say in an experiment, or indirectly would be if you just have some sort of record of what people did, and then you take this behavior and code it and put it into a data set. It might sound a little abstract, but when you go through the examples, you'll see that this is everywhere. So in terms of examples, the Correlates of War project. This is a data set that looks at the different conditions behind wars throughout history going back approximately 200 years. So it records all conflicts and records characteristics of different governments that went to war with one another. Or you could have the FEC. So the FEC releases a lot of data sets that political scientists use that include not only election results, but also data about, say, campaign contributions. And so the FEC collects this data, and you could use it to look at, say, here, the example of corporations that have made contributions to PACs. So this is a data set that indirectly observes what people have done in terms of their contributions to political campaigns. Lab and field experiments also use indirect or direct observation. So you've implemented some sort of treatment, and then you see what people do next. So basically anything where you want to be recording not what people think, but what they actually do in practice would be considered to be an observational data set. We can also look at different forms of media and code and categorize these through content analysis. So content analysis is a systematic procedure by which records, they could be documents, they could be campaign ads, they could be television programs, media coverage, are transformed into quantitative data. All right. So in terms of media sources, you could take newspapers, news coverage. So there's a project called GDELT, and GDELT tracks media throughout the world and looks at stories that have emerged on different phenomena, on different conflicts, on protests. So it takes all media and puts it into this big data set. All right. So here we see this is from news sources that are covered throughout the world, and they have a lot of interesting visualizations that go along with the GDELT data set. You could also have content analysis of laws and institutions. So similar idea that you're taking what is written down and then you're coding it in some way. So examples of this would be Freedom House, where Freedom House may look at some of the existing institutions. Does a country have checks and balances? What's in their constitution? What are in their laws? What are in their formal procedures? And how do those match up with democracy? So they use this to produce maps of freedom. They use it to categorize countries in terms of how free, how open, how democratic those countries are. And then another project is called the Comparative Constitutions Project, run out of UT Austin. And in the Comparative Constitutions Project, they've collected all constitutions from every country throughout the world going back hundreds of years, and they have coded the different rights and prerogatives that are contained in these constitutions. So you go to the Comparative Constitutions Project and you can, one, get the actual constitutions, but two, you can also get the data sets of saying whether a country has freedom of speech in their constitution, whether they have social rights like the right to health care in their constitution, how long are the constitutions, whereas the United States Constitution is fairly short. Other countries, such as Brazil, have constitutions that are well over 100 pages. So this maps out and puts into a quantitative data set all of these rights, prerogatives that are part of constitutions throughout the world.